Great, thank you so much. I'm Michele O'Neil, President of the ACTU, and I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay all my respects to their elders past and present, and it always was and it always will be Aboriginal land. Thanks so much for making time to come in this afternoon, and I want to particularly welcome Professor Ross Garnaut, who I will introduce in a little bit more detail in a moment, and thank him for his time today. But also welcome to all of you, and thanks very much for putting aside this time in a very busy period of time for us at the ACTU. We've got some growth and campaigns and executive meetings this week and next, but we really appreciate that you've come to listen to this very important address. And it's also a historic address because it's the first leadership forum of our new Australian Trade Union Institute, which is part of the change and restructuring and work we've been doing at the ACTU to look at how we move to make sure that our movement is really focusing the work that we do on how we build and grow unions. And as part of that, with the new ATUI, we're going to be having these regular leadership forums and opportunities where we bring together leaders, sometimes for sessions like this, which may only be a couple of hours at a time, or in fact there'll also be residential offerings that'll be going for a couple of weeks at a time. And as well as the leadership work, we'll be doing a lot of other work aimed at our rank and file activists and our delegates and our union staff and officers all over the country. And this opportunity to both have people come in virtually as well as here in person, and we're videoing the event so we can make it available to others as well, is an important part of being a lot more flexible about how we get new information and ideas out to the maximum number of people in our movement. So this comes on, the reason we decided that this was an important forum for leadership at the beginning of this year was we have also at the ACTU over the last 4 months really upped the level of resource and work that we're doing in the climate change, energy and just transition area. And that is being partly driven by Mark Wakeham, who's joined us as our Senior Policy Officer in that area and is known now to many of you, who he's been talking to in a fair amount of detail over the last 4 months about what is the focus of our work on climate change and energy and just transition into the future. And I know a lot of your unions and a lot of you are very deeply involved already in this work. And it's not a new area of work for the ACTU. It's not like we've never delved into it before. In fact, we've got a very proud history of work that was led by one of my predecessors, Sharon Burrow, when she was the president of the ACTU, where we did some of the world leading work amongst ACTU affiliates, and in particular those affiliates that were in the resource intensive industries at the time around what needed to happen as far as trying to reduce emissions. But as we all know, that work has not been as much of a focus over the last decade or so, but because it is increasingly urgent, and because we understand that this is an issue that touches every single worker, every job, every sector, every industry, that this is not a story just about isolated sectors, as important the story is for those in the resource intensive sectors. It's actually a story about what's happening to our planet, but it's what's happening to the future of work and the future of jobs and our safety, and how it impacts on workers' health and safety, as well as what will be the jobs of the future. And one key part of that is what's happening in energy. And we are very excited to read and hear the work that Professor Garnaut had done about thinking about this in the long term, thinking about this in the immediate, about what needs to be done to urgently cut emissions, but also about how this links to jobs, how this links to Australia's capacity to be a leader as far as being able to have good quality renewable energy jobs here, but also to our exports, because exports is critical, of course, to our economy and to local jobs as well. So we're really looking forward to hear from Professor Garnaut. We know climate change is a workers' issue, and there'll be time to have some questions following Professor Garnaut's address. So I do want to move now to introduce him properly. So Professor Garnaut is a Professor of Economics at the University of Melbourne. He's the author of a number of influential reports to the Australian government, including Australia and the Northeast Asian Ascendancy, the Review of Federal State Financial Relations, the Garnaut Climate Change Review in 2008, and again the Garnaut Review in 2011, which was Australia and the Global Response to Climate Change. He's had a long and very distinguished career as a best-selling author, policy advisor, diplomat and businessman, including as a principal economic advisor to someone familiar, who in fact this room is named after, Bob Hawke. And he was the Australian ambassador to China in 1985 to 1988. Recently, he's written Superpower, Australia's low-carbon opportunity, which has had significant media coverage and influence in helping charter a pathway for Australia to make a successful transition to a low-emissions economy while remaining an energy superpower. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ross Garnaut.
Thank you, Michelle, and very nice to be talking to this group. Nice to be reminded of my old boss too, and who we farewelled last year, who used to make it clear to all in our office that the relationship with the ACTU was the centrally important one to Australia working properly, and we treated that with great respect. Michelle's mentioned my climate change reviews in 2008 and 2011 and my recent work. And one of the things I'll do today is talk about what changed between 2008 and now. A lot of things stayed the same, but some things changed. And the book Superpower is built around looking at what has changed since 2008. The 2008 report was commissioned by all of the state and territory governments of Australia initially in April 2007. 6 states, 2 territories. Anna Bligh actually made contact with me on behalf of all of the states and territories and asked if I'd do this work. The leader of the opposition, Kevin Rudd, had said that the Commonwealth would join the exercise to make it a federal state exercise if he became Prime Minister at the elections later that year. The states invited the Commonwealth Government to join. Mr Howard declined the invitation, and so it didn't become a federal state piece of work until the end of the year. But it was a really thorough and purposeful bit of work. I had a lot of resources from the states and territories, and then the Commonwealth as well, very detailed modelling of the effects both of climate change itself on the Australian economy going out to the end of this century, but also of the costs of mitigating it, of Australia playing its fair share, doing its fair share in a global effort to combat climate change. It was well resourced. The initial modelling was done with support from I had a secretary down in the Victorian Premier's Department, support from the Queensland Treasury and the Centre of Policy Studies, then at Monash University, now Victoria. When the Commonwealth joined, we had the Treasury come in and put more firepower behind it. So we had an elaborate look in detail at both the costs of climate change, if we didn't do anything about it, what we gained by avoiding damaging climate change, and then the costs of doing our fair share in mitigating climate change, in reducing emissions under various scenarios. That detailed modelling, as reported in 2008, told a story of climate change imposing large economic damage. climate change is an environmental issue, it's a social justice issue, as the Pope has reminded us. It has huge international relations dimensions, but it's also an Australian economic policy issue. And I had expert groups studying the economic impacts of what the science was saying was going to be the warming that would take place if we didn't do anything about climate change, changes in weather patterns, rainfall patterns. I had detailed studies done on how that would increase the cost of a lot of infrastructure to make it robust against more extreme weather events. How the work showed that the drying of and warming of the Murray-Darling Basin with much lower stream flows, partly as a result of evaporation, partly as a result of low rainfall, would reduce irrigation output of agriculture by 90%. Summing all of those effects, we were able to form a view on the costs of climate change. A lot of these costs in the modelling came out gradually as the 21st century went on. Some appeared relatively early, some became bigger and bigger over time. The modelling only went out to the end of the century, but the costs kept on getting bigger, and it was quite clear that costs beyond this century were going to be very much larger than those felt this century. They kept on getting bigger if you didn't do anything about climate change. Temperature increases would continue so long as we had positive net emissions. You had to actually have zero net emissions to stop the worsening of climate change. Australia alone couldn't deal with the problem. Australia had to work within a cooperative international effort, or at least a concerted international effort, and I did a lot of work on how the international system would deal with the problem and how Australia's contribution would fit into a wider system. I did very detailed modelling on the costs of our doing our fair share in a global effort. And the modelling at that time showed that there were significant but not overwhelming costs out to increasing out to the middle of the century. And then from then, the cost increases started to slow down, and the benefits from avoided climate change became bigger and bigger over time. So later in the century, the benefits clearly exceeded the costs. Amongst the early costs, one of those was that in those days, back in 2008, the costs of renewable energy, zero emissions energy, were very much higher than the costs of coal-based energy. I've actually got a chart in Superpower in which I compare the total costs of solar, capital and operating costs, just with the operating costs of coal, which is mainly of coal-based generators, mainly the coal itself. And back in 2008, there's a ratio of about 10 to 1, 10 times more expensive, the full costs of solar, capital and recurrent against the cost of coal going into a coal plant. And I did a lot of consultation, or at least my team, a very good team, a lot of consultation with the people who should know, people working in the frontiers of technology, but also people in business working on solar technology, not only in Australia. I talked to people and my team talked to people in the US, Japan, Korea, China, Germany, UK, and we built in, after all of that consultation, we built into the modelling an assumption that the cost of equipment for photovoltaic solar would fall by a few % per annum. When the report came out, there was some criticism that we'd over-egg the pudding, that costs wouldn't fall that much, and at the time, the official forecasts of what would happen in future, the cost of solar, for example, from the Australian Energy Market Operator, suggested that there'd just be a much slower reduction in cost. There'd be some reduction of cost looking forward, but a much slower one. What's happened since then is the cost of the photovoltaic capital equipment has fallen by, well, in the first decade after my report, they fell by about 85%, dramatically more than I had assumed. Something similar happened in wind, but not quite so dramatically. partly because wind costs had started to fall earlier. The big costs in solar came later. With solar and wind, they are intermittent energy sources, and you need to balance them in various ways so that you can turn them into 24/7 power. The key mechanisms for balancing are long-distance transmission. That way you can average out different climatic conditions in different parts of the country. It's not the wind patterns that bring very good wind resource to the west-facing coasts of South Australia and southwest Victoria. The wind blows at very different times from the good wind resource of northern New South Wales or central Queensland. So if you've got good transmission between them, that helps to balance it out. Sun's not blocked by a cloud at the same time in Mildura as in Barcaldine. And in a big country, just spatial differences give you some difference in solar incidence between the far west of our national grid in Port Lincoln and the far east in Brisbane. There's a solar time difference of an hour. That means that that eastern power can run South Australia through an hour of the morning peak, and western power can run Brisbane through an hour in the evening peak if you've got strong transmission between them. So one of the balancing mechanisms was high voltage transmission. A second was peaking power, which at the moment, or certainly at the time we did our report, was going to be mainly gas, but it can be other forms of thermal energy, but bioenergy where it's available, or it can be hydrogen. But at the time, in 2008, it looked as if it was going to be mainly gas. Gas was then cheap in Australia. It was cheaper than in any other part of the developed world. Since then, of course, we had excess capacity put in at Gladstone, and now Australian gas, it used to be 1/3 the cost of American gas available for domestic manufacturers. Now it's 3 times the cost of American gas as a result of it becoming an exportable commodity through Gladstone, and a result of the capacity in Gladstone exceeding the domestic availability of gas. So gas has tended to price itself out of the market, but other forms of storage, pumped hydro storage, I talked about that in the 2008 report. Hydro and old technology, you use the same equipment to pump water up a hill in the same pipe from one lower dam to a higher dam. When you need power, you pump water up a hill using power when it's available in abundance and cheap. For example, solar in the middle of the day. In West Australia at the moment, it's quite often for net prices of power to be negative in the middle of the day because they're getting so much rooftop solar from Perth. And then so you pump water up to the higher dam, you run it down through the same pipe and generate the same pipe and pump, but the pump, same machine operating in reverse, becomes a generator, and so the power becomes available when you need it, when power is scarce and abundant. And then the other balancing mechanism was demand management. Technologies then for demand management were not as well developed as they are now. So combination of all of these mechanisms were going to be required to balance renewable energy as the solar and wind proportions increased. Well, the second big change since 2008 has been that the technology for demand management has improved considerably. I didn't mention battery storage as one of the ways of storing power, an alternative to pumped hydro. And battery storage has fallen on a similar cost reduction curve to photovoltaic. And all of the sources of balancing, transmission, the pumped hydro, battery in particular, are mainly capital. and rather than operating costs. Gas has substantial operating costs. The others mainly capital. And so they, like renewable energy itself, have been huge beneficiaries of an historic change in the cost of capital in the world since I did my report. This is of great significance for many things, but it's certainly of great significance for the cost of moving from traditional fossil sources of energy to renewable energy. For most of history since the Industrial Revolution, the cost of low-risk capital, borrowing by strong governments, has been 5% and more in real terms, 5% and more per annum plus inflation. Well, in recent years, the cost of capital has been roughly zero in real terms, a bit below zero now in all the developed countries, including Australia. Renewable energy, battery storage, pumped hydro storage, high voltage, long distance transmission are almost all capital. So that if the cost of capital is almost zero, you get, well, if it's fallen dramatically, you get a very big reduction if your capital markets are working competitively in the cost of renewable energy. But the same thing doesn't happen to the cost of thermal generation, where the main costs are the cost of the coal and the costs of the gas. So that in Superpower, I've got a chart that shows the cost of total costs of solar, both the capital and the operating cost back in 2010 and the costs today, compared with the cost of the coal alone for a New South Wales coal generator. And whereas it was about 10 to 1 against solar energy back in 2010, they're pretty well line ball today. So even if you don't have to worry about the cost of the equipment itself, the generator, it's the cost of solar and wind is as low as the coal alone going into a coal generator. And that's mainly the result of the fall in the cost of equipment, but significantly as well the result in the fall of capital costs, which disproportionately benefits renewable energy over other forms of energy. What's the source of this rather dramatic fall in the cost of equipment? Well, in any new technology in its early stages of deployment, increased scale of deployment leads to very big improvements in manufacturing efficiency. That 85% reduction in photovoltaic panel costs is the cumulative effect of many, many small improvements in manufacturing efficiency. If you go right back to the beginning of use of solar power, about commercial use about 40 years ago, late last century, or in the 80s, right through that time, and I've got a chart to show this in Superpower, every time the deployment of solar doubles, then average costs of the equipment have fallen about 24%. The remarkable thing is it's stayed on that curve. Now, it won't stay on there forever. We won't end up with zero costs of photovoltaic panels, and so it will level out at some time, but it hasn't started to level out yet. And that's been going, there's been many, many doublings over that time, and we're tending to get a doubling every few years now, and costs are still falling on that curve. Something similar happens with all new technologies. It's happening with the electric car. It's happening with batteries. It started earlier, but it's still happening to some extent with wind. How does it come about? Well, there are technological breakthroughs from time to time, but most of it is just learning by doing things better and manufacturing in the places where costs are lower. Just to try to understand this process, I've been visiting one of China's, one of the world's big solar manufacturing plants in Zhejiang province in the south every few years for quite a while, and just seeing what's happening, and the reduction of costs, which have been on that same curve as in other places, have been the results of lots of small improvements. For example, there's quite a lot of expensive metal in a photovoltaic panel, aluminium, some copper, even some silver for some specialised uses. Well, they've reduced the use of all those metals by more than 80%, just by experience and becoming better at it. And it's the accumulation of lots of small things, more than the big technological breakthroughs, that's responsible for the falling costs. So one very big thing that's changed since 2008 has been a much more rapid reduction in the cost of renewable energy and balancing renewable energy than we were expecting back then. And I highlight that in the book. Today I'll focus mainly on developments with industrial implications, because but in the discussion, if you want me to go beyond that into other things, I will. There's a very big implication for Australia in the global movement towards zero emissions energy. The commitment of all countries to zero emissions by about the middle of the century. It's a clear implication of the Paris Agreement that we will have zero emissions by mid-century or before. That comes from the commitment to hold temperature increases to less than 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5. To get to 1.5, we'd have to have zero emissions a number of years before 2050. In a world of zero emissions energy, Australia has unusual advantages. We have the best combinations of wind and solar resources, certainly in the developed world, but as a combination, I can't find better places on a large scale in the world. Unless we muck up the opportunity, and sometimes we do waste opportunities, but unless we muck it up, we should be the low-cost energy producer of the zero emissions world. And that gives us a competitive advantage in energy-intensive industry. It's what happens unless we muck it up. Now, big structural changes don't happen without a lot of people making good decisions, supporting government policy of various kinds, good business decisions, a lot of training of people, but all of those should be part of good industry policy in general. And in that world, where the world is relying on zero emissions energy, we'll have unique advantages. Now, we've got advantages in energy in the fossil energy world. We're the biggest exporter of coal when you add thermal coal and metallurgical coal together. And we're the world's biggest exporter now, as of this year, in natural gas. So we had advantages in the fossil energy economy as well. And those advantages were important for the Australian standard of living. For a lot of years, they gave us relatively low-cost electricity prices for households and were helpful for a number of industries. Low gas prices, I've mentioned that for a long time we had the lowest gas prices in the developed world. That was supportive of substantial gas processing industries, petrochemicals and related industries, mainly in Melbourne, Geelong and Adelaide. The coal advantage was the basis of the aluminium industry that emerged in Gladstone, Newcastle and Portland in the 1980s. That's a really interesting story. In the 1970s, in the early 1970s, energy was abundant. Amongst other things, oil was cheap and abundant. Oil is very easily and cheaply transportable. A country like Japan that had no energy resources simply imported oil and to a lesser extent coal and was a centre of a lot of energy-using industries. Japan was the biggest aluminium producer in the developed world. Russia was bigger, but Japan was the biggest in the developed world. Two things happened through the 70s. One, the oil price went up, and so energy costs in an energy importing country went up. Japan responded to that partly by importing more coal, but it still had reasonable costs of energy. And then they started to take environmental issues more seriously. In those days, not climate change, the applied science hadn't worked out how much damage unmitigated climate change would do. But air pollution became a very big issue. Tokyo air, when I started visiting Tokyo in '69, was worse than Beijing today. Once incomes reached a certain level in Japan, the priority of cleaning up the environment, there'd been big health problems as well as amenity problems, was pushing governments to do more. And so Japan took a number of steps related to the environment and trying to economise on energy use that led to the shifting offshore of virtually all of the aluminium producing capacity of what had been the world's biggest producer of aluminium. And at that time, we were a very attractive location, made more attractive because governments in all three states, Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, gave special concessions, and we ended up the world's biggest aluminium exporter, helped by the fact that we started as the world's biggest exporter of aluminium oxide, aluminium ore, bauxite and alumina. So for a while we had a quite big position in aluminium. We still do today, although it's not as big as it was. So all of these were benefits of having a strong endowment of coal and gas, of fossil energy. It contributed positively to the Australian economy and the Australian standard of living in the country as a whole, as well as in particular regions. We became a very big exporter of coal and gas. That became the source of other jobs, incomes, and made an additional contribution. So I'm very aware of that contribution and respectful of it. Back in my 2008 review, adding to the costs of electricity and energy through a carbon price would have made a lot of our domestic energy-using industries less competitive. And so a huge effort was put into making sure that carbon pricing did not reduce the competitiveness of those industries. And a lot of my 2008 report is about mechanisms that would avoid any loss of competitiveness. And I thought we handled all that very well. We put in place mechanisms for a proportion of free permits for energy-intensive trade-exposed industries that maintained incentives for economising on emissions because they were based on emissions on a baseline before the carbon price came in, so that a company that succeeded in reducing emissions would still get the same number of free permits as it got at the beginning of carbon pricing and could sell them, make a profit from it if it did enough on emissions reduction. I think those arrangements were very well worked out, and despite Tony Abbott and Barnaby Joyce talking about wiping Gladstone and Newcastle and Whyalla off the map, what was put in place when carbon pricing came in under the Gillard government very carefully protected industry against that through these mechanisms that I've mentioned. Just in Whyalla, which became famous when Abbott said that would be wiped off the map, and my former student, Trade Minister Craig Emerson, sang very badly about the wipeout at Whyalla. The plant there, the steelmaking plant, found that they could reduce emissions quite a lot by shifting from using hematite in blast furnaces to magnetite. Hematite Fe2O3, magnetite Fe3O4, same amount of carbon produced more iron using magnetite than hematite, so they started exporting the hematite and using the magnetite themselves and reduced their emissions so much that they did have surplus permits, so it became, in a way, a subsidy for them, but in a way that maintained incentives for reducing emissions. So that wasn't very well understood, and a lot of people who were critical of the package because they said it wasn't environmentally strong enough were criticising the giving of free permits to a lot of these industries, but they were given in a way that did not reduce incentives to reduce emissions. Well, we did have carbon pricing from 2012 to 2014. Julia Gillard's government introduced all of that. I was brought back into the saddle to do another report. Greg Combay, a lot of background here, was the Minister for Climate Change, and Greg made sure that all of those arrangements that we'd worked through on making sure that the arrangements didn't disadvantage Australian industry were there in the carbon pricing, and they worked very effectively. And the proof is in the pudding. Those couple of years of carbon pricing, there was a bit of an increase in the cost of living, exactly as we'd modelled it. Electricity prices went up, but there was no reduction in the standard of living of Australian workers or Social Security beneficiaries, because 7 billion was collected in revenue, and that was given back as an increase in the tax-free threshold, which was fully compensated low and median income workers for the increase in prices, and also was used to adjust Social Security payments. So there was complete protection against the increase in prices at the low and the middle of the income distribution. There was no negative effect on economic growth. You can see it in the statistics. There was no negative effect on emissions-intensive industry like aluminium, steel. You can see that in the statistics. In fact, the big problems for a lot of those industries came after Abbott abolished carbon pricing, when prices went up a lot, electricity prices, and there was no mechanism for insulating industry from that. There were even bigger increases in power prices after carbon pricing ended, but no mechanism for insulating domestic industry from that. The story was that we had a strong base in energy-intensive industries. We'd done well out of the fossil energy economy. Our emphasis in 2008 and 2011 was making sure that this established industry was not disadvantaged because we'd gone further than some of our competitors in introducing carbon pricing. Well, the story is very different today. If you just look at that aluminium industry, I think we can be quite sure that if they rely on the Trobe Valley coal for Portland, Hunter Valley coal for Tomago in New South Wales, Central Queensland coal for Gladstone, that we'll have no aluminium smelting by the late 20s. The only chance of survival is to move to lower cost, zero emissions energy through renewable energy. So just if you want the defensive play of saving what's already there, you have to get behind a shift in energy so we can get costs lower. And because the whole world is heading that way, and because we've got lower cost renewable energy than others, the advantage that we have from that shift will be greater than the advantage other countries get, and that will strengthen the competitiveness. And I confidently anticipate that we'll see, instead of closure, we'll see expansion of those aluminium smelters, but we'll also see new aluminium smelters. Not right now, because there's a bit of surplus of aluminium in the world, and prices are currently low, but there'll come a time when growing world demand needs new smelters. As everyone expects us to be moving towards a zero emissions world, the natural place for those new smelters will be Australia. The most natural place in the world is actually adjacent to the coal power generation mining town of Collie in Western Australia, which where you happen to have an alumina refinery, one of the world's big alumina refineries. And so instead of having to take that aluminium oxide for processing to Portland or to Madagascar, to Iceland or to Canada, and it goes to all of those places now, you just shove it straight into the aluminium smelter out the back of the plant. It will be a big advantage in using the low-cost energy to be at the nodes of the old transmission system. The transmission system that once took power out from Collie, or for that matter from the Latrobe Valley or Newcastle or Gladstone, or in the case of Collie, back to Perth, to the Midwest, north of Perth, to the wheat belt and the eastern goldfields, Kalgoorlie, or south to Albany and the Great Southern. Coal power once went out to all those places. These happen to all be centres of potentially very rich renewable energy resources, and those transmission lines can, instead of becoming redundant, can bring renewable energy back to energy-intensive processing in the Collie region. I'm talking a bit to the West Australian government about how to help that to happen. But I'll just mention a couple of other industries. I'm going on a bit long, Michelle, and I want to leave plenty of time, but I'll just mention a couple of other industries. Aluminium's got a big place in our history. It can be a much richer history. Our advantages are much greater in the zero emissions world economy than they were in the fossil energy economy. Australian coal, taken from central Queensland to iron ore resource in West Australia, actually costs more to transport than it does to take it to Kobe or Shanghai for processing in Korea or Japan. But Australian renewable energy is not exportable in the same way. We get very little advantage today from our abundant natural gas because it's available in East Asia. It costs not very much lower and not very much higher than costs here. So competitively, we get very little advantage from that. But our rich renewable energy resources will have a sustainable advantage because you can't so easily can't so cheaply transport renewable energy to another country. You can put in a high voltage transmission line, but that's going to cost as much as the energy itself. So it's going to be much more expensive to use in industrial activities in Asia than in Australia. There's a huge opportunity in turning iron ore into iron metal. I still am a West Australian, still barrack for the West Coast Eagles, and I grew up in WA during the time when the iron ore mines were first being started, and it was always a disappointment to me that effort wasn't made into using Australian advantages in early stage processing of the iron ore. Despite the fact that we had the world's best resources and the state government made some processing in West Australia a condition of access to those leases, but those conditions have never been honoured. I think in some cases they're still there in the leases, but they've never been honoured. So that's a little personal disappointment I had when I was working with Hawke. We had a crack at the early stages of China's industrialisation, getting the Chinese to think about, instead of building integrated steel mills using Australian iron ore and in blast furnaces, to think of, at least for a proportion of their requirements, bringing in semi-processed material. They actually saw the advantages of that, but Australian industry at the time was not interested, mainly because the rate of return on mining, partly because our royalty regimes are so lax that leaves rates of return in mining very high levels, were very much higher than rates of return on the world's most profitable manufacturing. So a chief executive in a company like BHP or Rio Tinto had to actually choose to lower average returns on equity for its shareholders if it did any investment in manufacturing. And so they went in the opposite direction. BHP sold off its steel. It got the world's best resources of coal, the Queensland metallurgical coal, and iron ore in West Australia because it was Australia's steelmaking. But that was so profitable, mining that and exporting it with low royalties, that it closed the steelmaking that had been the reason they'd been given free the world's best resources. So I think we get another chance in the zero emissions world, another chance to as an iron producer. Everyone's going to have to change technology. So the fact that you now have well-established steel making in China and Korea and Japan is not so crucial when everyone has to change their technology. The zero emissions path to steel making will be, or iron making, the early stage, will be through use of renewable energy to make hydrogen. Now, those of you from the steel industry, or those who've done high school chemistry, know that the process in a coal and coke, which under heat and pressure takes the oxygen atoms out of iron oxide and leaves iron metal. Well, you can do a very similar thing with hydrogen. When you use coke, the exhaust is carbon dioxide. When you use when you use hydrogen, the exhaust is water. It takes out the hydrogen, and water is the exhaust, and you're left with iron metal. Technically, it's quite easily done, and costs are currently higher than using metallurgical coal, but that's partly because we've spent 150 years honing the coal-based steel-making processes. Costs came down a lot in steel in the first 70 years of that 150 years, and haven't come down much in recent years. We're at the very early stages of making the electrolyzers through which electricity going through water releases hydrogen and oxygen, and the hydrogen then goes into the iron-making process. The cost of electrolyzers will come down, like the cost of batteries and photovoltaic, as volume of use increases. There's a number of different ways you could make zero emissions iron, but at this stage it looks to me as if the low-cost route is probably going to be using hydrogen from renewable energy. But when that happens, first of all, it's an advantage to be the main world source of iron ore, which we are. Secondly, hydrogen will be made most cheaply in places with first-class combinations of renewable energy, of oxygen, and of wind and solar. It's a big advantage to have both. It's a big advantage if you don't have to store electricity. I noticed an announcement yesterday by the Tasmanian government. They've got a special advantage with all that hydro, but in other circumstances, renewable energy requires costly storage. It can be cheap in Tasmania. That costly storage is not required in the hydrogen process because you can just stop the plant when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing. But to have good wind and good solar means the plant's operating more of the day, and we've got great combinations in a number of locations in Australia. So Australia will have a big advantage in processing its own iron in the zero emissions world economy. And that's an advantage that won't be taken away by international trade as it is for coal and for gas. You can export hydrogen, and Alan Finkel, Chief Scientist's report, talks a lot about exporting hydrogen as hydrogen, either as a liquid or as ammonia, which is made from hydrogen, and then you can release the hydrogen from ammonia when it gets to another country. But both of these processes, the liquefaction of hydrogen and transporting it internationally as a liquid, and ammonia, are very expensive processes. In the case of making ammonia, you have to have huge pressure and energy use, an expensive bit of capital equipment through the Haber-Bosch process to combine the nitrogen from the atmosphere with the hydrogen to make ammonia. So that's a very big extra cost. In the case of hydrogen itself, you've got to cool it to minus 253 degrees before it will liquefy. That's nearly absolute zero. Absolute zero is where electrons stop vibrating. It takes huge pressure, huge amounts of energy for that to happen. And so you'll use half of the energy in hydrogen to liquefy it. Plus, it's very expensive to transport. Tiny molecules need special equipment. There will be trade in hydrogen. It will be a useful export industry, but it won't be the base of industry, competitive industry in Japan and Korea and China as coal has been, because it will be 3 times as expensive to use Australian hydrogen in Japan as to use it in Australia, whereas in the case of coal, it's more or less the same cost in Japan as in Australia. So this will be a very large competitive advantage. So I can't see why we are not naturally the world's main centre for processing iron in the zero emissions world economy. I talk in the book about a number of other industries. Ammonia itself, quite a big industry in international trade, 6 million tonnes. We only produce 1% of the world total now. Silicon, a huge growth industry. It's pure silicon is needed for photovoltaic panels, and it's the main material in photovoltaic panels and also in computers, silicon chips. Huge growth in demand, a huge industry. What you need for silicon is sand or quartz, and we've got a bit of that in Australia, and huge amounts of energy. It's even more energy intensive than aluminium. But most minerals processing is energy intensive. The old Australian industries, lead and zinc and silver, but also new ones that are becoming important for the new equipment for the zero emissions world economy, like vanadium, titanium, lithium. They all require a lot of energy. So we're going to have a natural advantage in a wide range of industries. So Michele, just to conclude, I just mentioned one other big source of industrial advantage in the zero emissions economy of the future for Australia. We will not be using, the world will not be using coal, gas or oil as a base for petrochemicals and plastics industries in the zero emissions economy. They're very emissions intensive. We'll probably be using biomass. And Australia is, relative to population, that's what matters in comparative advantage and economic things, has the world's richest potential for per capita for generating low-cost biomass in various forms. We currently export quite a lot of it as chips, but it's going to be a very valuable resource for industrial processes when we're not using fossil energy for plastics and other chemicals, and many of the plastics and related chemical industries use a lot of energy. So the combination of available biomass and energy is going to be a very rich combination. So there's going to be another range of industries in which Australia naturally has great advantages in the zero emissions economy of the future. So there are all reasons to make this work properly, quite independently of the fact that we'll be avoiding catastrophic disruption of our way of life. Thanks.